Little Lilibet was never meant to be queen. At the time of her birth, she was only third in line for the throne. Her uncle was the heir apparent, and if her parents had had a son, he would supersede her in position. But they didn't. So in time, little Lilibet would grow to become the person known as Queen Elizabeth II, a monarch who helped define an era. Born April 21st, 1926, Elizabeth was the eldest child of Albert, Duke of York, and Elizabeth, Duchess of York. Beloved by her grandfather, King George V, Elizabeth was a frequent visitor to the royal residence. Her childhood nickname of Lilibet comes from her own inability as a toddler to properly pronounce her own name. On January 20th, 1936, King George V died, leaving his eldest son, Edward, as heir to the throne. However, while George had acted as the expected national symbol of calm and confidence during the era of the Great War and the Great Depression, Edward was more of a roaring twenties sort of a chap. He was widely pilloried in the press for being a bon vivant, a womanizer, and worst of all, possibly having pro-German sympathies. In short, he was unpopular. Further complicating his situation was his romantic involvement with a twice-divorced American socialite named Wallis Simpson. Edward's intent to marry her immediately clashed with his role as the head of the Church of England, which, at the time, did not allow divorcees to remarry. It's a bit ironic considering the origins of the Church of England, I suppose. Faced with the choice of leaving Simpson or giving up the throne, Edward chose the latter. At just 326 days, his was the shortest reign by a British monarch. Edward's younger brother Albert, Duke of York, ascended to the throne as George VI. His eldest daughter, Elizabeth, was thus the new heir apparent. While some sort of normalcy had returned to Buckingham Palace, the rest of the world was in turmoil. Tensions in Europe were high, and over the next 3 years would reach a boiling point. On September 1st, 1939, George VI sadly followed in his father's footsteps by becoming a ruler of a nation at war. During the Blitz, plans were made to evacuate the teenaged princesses Elizabeth and Margaret to Canada. However, this plan was soundly rejected by their mother, and the royal family remained in the UK for the duration of the war. Despite being just a teenager, Elizabeth contributed to the war effort by assisting in propaganda campaigns, rationing drives, and through some of her first addresses to the nation, primarily aimed to comfort the children. A good deal of this was her expected duty, but to her credit, Elizabeth wanted to do more. When she turned 18 in 1944, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service. As the women's branch of the British Army, the ATS provided critical support roles during the war. Elizabeth was trained as a vehicle mechanic and a driver. She really demonstrated that she was a citizen of Britain first and a royal second. Following the war, Elizabeth resumed the regular duties of a princess, including accompanying her parents on a grand tour of the Commonwealth in 1947. Another major event of Elizabeth's life occurred that same year. She got married. Since 1939, Elizabeth had been exchanging letters with a Philip Mountbatten, a prince of both Denmark and Greece. After nearly a decade of courtship, the couple was wed on November 20th, 1947. Philip was given the title of Duke of Edinburgh, a title which he kept until his death in April of 2021. At 73 years, Elizabeth and Philip's marriage was the longest in British royal history. Beginning in 1951, Elizabeth began to stand in for her father during public events, as his health was declining. One of these duties would include a tour of Australia in early 1952. However, Elizabeth never made it to Australia. On February 6th, King George died in his sleep. Having left home as a princess, Elizabeth returned as a monarch. A year later, on June 2nd, 1953, she was crowned. She chose to retain her birth name, and so was thus coronated as Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of British dominions beyond the seas, Queen, and Defender of the Faith. Interestingly, since her father had not allowed cameras into his coronation, Elizabeth's remains the only British coronation to be filmed, not to mention televised. It was a major media event around the world. Queen Elizabeth's reign is defined by the dramatic changes it witnessed during the latter half of the 20th century. Most notably, the messy process of decolonization, which transformed the old British Empire into the Commonwealth of Nations. Following the ruination of World War II, the UK was forced to come to terms with the fact that it was no longer a globe-straddling superpower. Elizabeth's reign began with the Suez Crisis of 1956 and continued through the decolonization of African and Caribbean areas in the 60s and 70s, sometimes called the Wind of Change era. The Commonwealth of Nations is basically an association of former imperial territories. Now they're all nations of free and equal status, sharing a diplomatic bond based on shared history and language. There are currently 56 member states. So this shift was reflected by a change in Queen Elizabeth's formal title to include, and of her other realms and territories, Queen, and Head of the Commonwealth. That is, rather than the old imperialist term of British dominions beyond the seas. You can see why they did that. And of course, her reign also witnessed the trauma of the Troubles in Ireland. Well, despite all the royal pomp and circumstance, we should remember that Queen Elizabeth was a real person underneath. She had hobbies and a personal life free from the public eye. Since the days of her childhood, Queen Elizabeth was a huge animal lover. She got her first dog at age 7, a Pembroke Corgi named Roosevelt Golden Eagle, or Dookie for short. And the rest was basically history. During her tenure as queen, Elizabeth had more than 30 corgis, including over 14 generations of the same family. Elizabeth also maintained the fascination with automobiles that she developed back in the 1940s. There's a great true story about her hazing the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia by personally driving him around the back roads of Scotland at breakneck speed, chatting the whole time. All of this while being very well aware that women were not permitted to drive in Saudi Arabia. I think she made her point. Even at the age of 100, Elizabeth was seen driving herself around state roads, so she never gave up doing that. Elizabeth had wit and a wry sense of humor. During the 2012 Olympics opening ceremony, she appeared in a now famous skit with Daniel Craig in his role of James Bond. According to Craig, not only was the Queen immediately excited about the role, but she also was cracking jokes with the cast and improvising lines the whole time. As I'm sure you know, the crown now moves to Her Majesty's eldest son, Charles, Prince of Wales. That title, Prince of Wales, by the way, has been reserved for the heir apparent of the British throne since the conquest of Wales over 700 years ago. Charles has been the longest-serving Prince of Wales in history due to his mother's long reign, and in turn, that makes him the oldest person ever to become a ruler of England. That in itself raises interesting discussions about his heir. And many people today question the rationale of maintaining the royal house at all. After all, aren't they just figureheads? Do they really exercise any real power? Well, politically, not really. However, it is clear that the royals do have power as symbols. Individual foibles aside, collectively the royal family has served as a focus, a living monument, as it were, to what it is to be English, or more broadly, to be British. We love to love them, we love to hate them, and they certainly help bring in the tourist money. Are they exemplars of good English values? Well, maybe not always. However, they do function as a symbol of continuity. Elizabeth herself reigned during perhaps the most tumultuous era of British history. She was the face of an era. Whether it was World War II, the Troubles, or Brexit, and calls now for Scottish independence, Queen Elizabeth remains a bridge linking Britain's past, and her present, and her future. And for that, she is absolutely worthy of remembering.